بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطاهرين ما دام ما في السماوات والأرضين اللهم إنا نسألك علما ينفعنا ويرفعنا اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وعملا متقبلا وشفاء من كل داء وبعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, all thanks and praise due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, who through His grace and mercy, we are gathered here this evening to acquire such knowledge that would guide us to and guide us along the straight path. We are now in our third session of working through the book Educating Children, classical advice for modern times. Today, inshallah, or this evening rather, we're starting from the following couplet, which reads as follows: وَأَن يُجَنِّبُهُ فُنُونَ الزِّينَةِ وَجُمْلَةَ الْمَلَابِسِ الرَّزِينَةِ وَيَكْسُهُ لَوْنَ بَيَاضِ الْقُطْنِ حَتَّى بِهِ عَنْ غَيْرِهِ يَسْتَغْنِي. So basically, just to put some context in terms of what we are discussing right now. Last week we looked at breastfeeding. Last week we also looked at eating and advices and etiquette regarding that. And today, inshallah, we will look at clothing and apparel. So, what advices our scholars have in this particular regard. So I'm going to follow the format of the book and work through the Arabic first, inshallah. And then as the author touches on certain advices, inshallah, we'll basically follow the same order and give some commentary on that bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as regards to clothing and apparel, the author says, وَأَن يُجَنِّبُهُ فُنُونَ الزِّينَةِ. And for those of us who have books, the translation reads as follows: and keep him away from various forms of adornment. وَأَن يُجَنِّبُهُ فُنُونَ الزِّينَةِ. Keep him away from all forms of adornment. وَجُمْلَةَ الْمَلَابِسِ الرَّزِينَةِ. And that particular couplet translates as, and also keep him away from all expensive type of clothing. That's the contemporary translation that they've given for that. So when we look at beauty, basically there are two types of beauty. The one is an outward beauty, and the one is an inward beauty. And here our translator Abdul Aziz, uniquely when it comes to discussing beauty, he gives different definitions for beauty. The one definition he offers of beauty is when you take something to beautify something else. When you take something to beautify something else. So I think an example that all of us can relate to would be the example that of makeup, for lack of a better example. So it's something that is used to beautify something else. So that's the one definition given to beauty. The other definition given to beauty is something that appeals to the eye while not understanding the essence and the reality of that particular thing. And if you look at the world has been defined as Darul Ghurur, a place of deception. And deception is defined as that which is outwardly beautiful, but the inner is something else altogether. So they say that which is apparent is beauty, but his inner is something else altogether. So, if we're going to expose our children to beauty, apparent beauty, then they won't be able to look beyond that and see the reality of things. So that is why in this particular couplet, our author says that at a young age, that the child should be kept away from things which are overly or apparently beautiful. This is to facilitate a certain idea, and it is that beauty in Islam, there's two levels of beauty. There's an outer beauty and an inner beauty. If you have both, then that is nurun ala nur, light upon light. And this particular idea of outer beauty and inner beauty, it is very well reflected in the following dua, the following supplication that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has taught us. And that is, when we look at the mirror, there are a few examples of this. When you look in the mirror, and then what dua do we read? We say, Allahumma anta hasanta khalqi fahassin khuluqi. Oh Allah, you have beautified my exterior. So that's a blessing. Fahassin khuluqi. But beautify my character. In other words, beautify my interior. Right? And then what comes to mind now, as I'm addressing you, is a particular supplication of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said, "Oh Allah, beautify." The exact wording doesn't come to mind, but oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make our external beautiful, right? And make our internal beautiful as well, and make our internal more beautiful than our external. So the focus really here is to beautify the interior. So if a child grows up and he grows up with very simple things, what happens is, as he grows older, he will develop an appreciation for beauty. Right? But he will be overly focused with developing the beauty of his interior. So if you look at all of these, that you mustn't expose children to beauty. What I mean by beauty is now an excess of beauty. Why is that? And you look at another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it says, "Inna Allah yuhibbu an yara atharahu athara ni'matihi ala abdi." That Allah loves to see the effect of His blessings upon a person. So, for example, if you have a nice set of clothing, should you wear the item of clothing or not? You should wear it according to this particular hadith, because Allah loves to see that when He blesses you with something, Allah loves to see the blessing upon you. But the child, if you train him with simple clothing, there will come a time in his life where he'll be able to see things for what they are, and at the same time, when he's exposed to beauty at that later stage, then he can appreciate it better, and he can understand that this beauty, is just face value, and he can look beyond things. But the moment you expose him to beauty from very early on, then everything what he makes his decision on is on the external. If something looks externally beautiful, and then he's going to go for that. So it's very important. And also it's very important because in terms of the development of the child. And now if you look at another angle altogether, and you look from the spiritual aspect, the spiritual development of the child. So what happens is, they say a child is like the nafs. A child, he always looks at the apparent. He always looks at the apparent. So a very simple example, your children, if you, for example, have a packet of crisp. Now you know the packaging of these crisps are very attractive. So you have a packet of crisp in your one hand, and you explain to the child that, look, that this is actually not very healthy. It contains MSGs, it contains this, that, and the other. And on the other hand, you have it filled with, let's say, almonds, or you have it filled with cashews. And you tell the child that, look, these are cashews, it contains this, that, and the other, it's very beneficial for you. What decision is the child going to make? The child is going to go for that which is apparently attractive, what he's attracted to. So he goes for the crisp. And he leaves that which might not look as nice, but it appears to be very beneficial. So when we train our children in terms of clothing when they're much younger, when we train them with simple clothing, what happens is, they get an appreciation how to appreciate things as they are, and they are not overly taken by the apparent beauty of things, because many things they look apparently appealing, but in reality they're not good, whereas other things they don't look that appealing, but in reality it's very good for us. So that's the training we give our children, and this is what the author rahimahullah wishes to bring across here in this particular bait. And then he says, وَيَكْسُهُ لَوْنَ بَيَاضِ الْقُطْنِ حَتَّى بِهِ أَنْ غَيْرِهِ يَسْتَغْنِي. So what type of clothing is the author advising us to clothe our children with? So he says, وَيَكْسُهُ لَوْنَ بَيَاضِ الْقُطْنِ, that when you dress your children up, you should try to dress them in white. You should try to dress them in white. And here there's a particular hadith to that effect. It says that wear white clothing and shroud your dead in white clothing. And this white clothing is a color which is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you must train him so much so with simple clothing. حَتَّى بِهِ عَنْ غَيْرِ يَسْتَغْنِي, up until he gets so used to wearing this simple type of clothing that it becomes part of his nature. He prefers simplistic things. So the training starts very early and you dress him in this particular way. There's another great fa'idah which the author mentions here as you go through these particular abiyat. What does he say? He says that when you dress them in white clothing, right, you actually save them from tribulations. So now he looks at it from another angle altogether, from a spiritual angle. So what is the spiritual benefit of it? Here's number one is, if a child is dressed very, very nice, so what happens is, a person might look at this child and he might look at the child with the eyes of jealousy. So now when the child is dressed very simply, so what happens? When he's dressed very simply, then he's automatically free from the tribulation which might come as a result of jealousy. Somebody casting an eye of jealousy upon him. That's number one. Number two, when he wears simple clothing, what happens is, automatically, if he's wearing fancy clothing, then the potential for him to develop an attitude of kibr, of pride, is greater. But when he or she is wearing very simple clothing, what happens? It is easier for them to be humble. Right? So those are the two benefits which the author mentions as regards to white clothing. Now just a note on that, on the issue of when they wear simple clothing, then they'll be saved from the jealous eye. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-aynu haqqun," that the eye is the truth. In other words, the jealous eye, that is the truth. But another note on that: while the children must be dressed simply, doesn't mean that they must be unkept. While you make every effort to keep it simple, it doesn't mean that they must be unkept. And some of our sati that they actually advise us, especially when you're going out and you're going out with your children, you must make sure that your children are well kept. They can be dressed simply but well kept. Why? Because a well kept child, if somebody sees him, right, and then what do they say? MashaAllah. Now that MashaAllah which they say is a dua for the child. Now what happens is, if the child is not well kept, what happens? Other people start asking, "Where's your mother? So that is like we're not going to say it's a bad dua, but everybody is asking, like, isn't there somebody looking after the child? So what would you rather want? Would you rather want the dua, mashallah, or would you want people saying, "Where's the mother of the child?" So while we keep things simple, but at the same time also the child needs to be kept. It shouldn't be. What happens is, in my own opinion, Allah SWT knows best. If you are unkept, you want to be very simple to the degree that you actually unkept. Now the idea is that you mustn't when you dress lavishly, you draw attention to yourself. But sometimes we go so simple to the degree that we're unkept that we draw attention to ourselves as well. So it defeats the purpose really. Right? So you must be simple but well kept in the same manner, and Allah SWT knows best. Khair. So thereafter the author goes on. So he says, وَإِن طَلَبَ مَنْقُوشًا أَوْ مُلَوَّلًا يَقُولُ ذَاكَ لِلنِّسَاءِ لَا لَنَا. So what happens now is, when you train the child and you provide very simple clothing for the child, so we know the benefits of that. Then if the child requests that he has clothing which is manqush, literally it means to be engraved, أو ملونا, or clothing of color, attractive clothing basically. يقول, then the parent should respond in relation to a male child. The parent should respond by saying, ذَاكَ لِلنِّسَاءِ لَا لَنَا. That engraved clothing and colored clothing, that is for women folk and not for us. So now let's look at the principle. The principle is that when you have female offspring and when you have male offspring, there must be, in terms of our instruction, there must be a clear distinction between the genders. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, Allah has created male folk and women folk. we spoke in the verse before, يَهَبُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ إِنَاثًا وَيَهَبُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ الذُّكُورَ. For some Allah grants male offspring and female offspring. But there's a certain etiquette in terms of the way we bring up our children. So much so that when they're very young, they can sleep in the same bed. But when they reach a certain age, and then we have to separate, girls in one bed and boys in another bed. Girls in one room, boys in another room. Why the separation? The separation is from very early on. We need to impress upon them that male folk and women folk, they play complementary roles, but distinct roles at the same time. So even in terms of clothing, right, that men folk in Islam, they wear a distinct type of apparel, whereas women folk wear a different type of apparel altogether. This is very important. And if we look at the laws of Sharia, we find that there's a distinction between male folk and women folk in terms of clothing. So by way of example, there are certain types of clothing that are allowed for male folk. So in other words, for male children. There's certain types of clothing allowed for female children, which are not allowed for male children. Silk, by way of example. It's not permissible for males to wear silk, except under certain circumstances. For example, when they're at war, as a armor, they wear a silk shirt, because the silk shirt is very well at deflecting, a blade. So in those circumstances, but under normal circumstances, males aren't allowed to wear silk. So therefore, male children shouldn't be given silk clothing to wear. Another distinction is when it comes to gold and silver. So we know in terms of gold and silver, in as far as utensils are concerned, it is prescribed on both males and females to use gold and silver utensils. So we need to exercise caution there. Sometimes we come to a place, we might take it for granted that those are stainless steel cutlery, but they might very well be silver cutlery. It's not permissible for male folk and women folk to use silver cutlery and gold cutlery and utensils. We come to gold and silver coins. Both males and females are allowed to use gold and silver coins. That's the ideal Islamic currency. But when it comes to jewelry, then women folk are allowed jewelry, gold and silver. Whereas men folk, on the other hand, they're only allowed to have silver jewelry, a silver ring, by way of example. So from early on, we need to train our children in this particular regard. Maybe a point of contention for us would be this whole issue of henna. Like henna generally is considered as something Allah knows best peculiar to women folk. But we do find sometimes that you find that the young children, the male folk, they also, henna is put on their hands and so forth. If it's for medication purposes, then fine. But for adornment and decoration, that is something else altogether. Because henna also had medical properties to it. You find some male folk, they actually put it at the bottom of their feet as a treatment. Right? So that's a different issue. But for adornment, so the point again, we can use many examples, but the point is that we treat our male offspring different from that which we treat our female offspring. And to sum this particular idea up, the Prophet ﷺ, in our tradition generally, there's severe chastisement and warning and a curse basically, which means that this person is far removed from the mercy of Allah. What type of person? An effeminate male person, a male person that adopts female ways, and the same a female person that adopts male ways. So while the children are young, we do have this phenomenon of like what we refer to as a tomboy, but it's not something that should be encouraged. You get a tomboy, and now the girl grows out of it. She was so a tomboy when she was younger, but now she grows out of it. It's something which mustn't be encouraged. And similarly also we find sometimes that certain male persons, very naturally, they just have effeminate ways around them. Islam is not pointing a finger at them. But this type of, if a person has effeminate ways and then we entertain that and now we start dressing up like a female and so forth, that is very problematic. Islam doesn't support that. And some of the challenge that we have in today's time, right, is basically linked to this type of upbringing. We must understand that naturally, women folk are different from male folk and male folk is different from women folk. Professor Abdul Hakim Murad, he has done certain studies on gender issues in particular. They had this kibbutz, like Jewish, like a type of camp. So what happens is, the theory is the liberalist, feminist theory is that the reason why females develop in a particular way and the reason why males develop in another way is because males are given exposure to certain things and then females are given exposure to other things. But when put to test, when males and female children were equally exposed to the same things, uniquely you would look and find the decisions that they made. So in this kibbutz from very young, what happened was they don't give the doll to the girl and they don't give the car to the boy. They leave the doll there and they leave the car there and they let the children make their own choices. And surprise, surprise, the girl goes for the doll and the boy goes for the car. Allah has just created them like that. فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها لا تبديل لخلق الله. So that is the natural disposition in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the human being. It is the parents that are responsible. And in this particular narration, it says the parents cause them to be Christian, the parents cause them to be Jewish, whatever the case may be. When we receive our children as a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we receive them in a pure and pristine form. And then we influence them, we mold them, we build them. So we should take, responsibility in that particular regard. So again, we should be very particular in terms of the way we rear our boys and also the way we rear our girls, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And then very importantly, and the value of this book, subhanallah, I've read it through now in preparing for this particular lesson. I've read it through a number of times, It's really, really very beneficial in terms of the points that are highlighted here. So if the child maybe requests for, engraved clothing and multicolored clothing and so forth. So in our terms, we don't normally express ourselves as engraved clothing, multicolored clothing. We basically just refer to it as brand names. As brand names, So the child wants a brand name. And I would invite you or urge you, on page 47 in the book to basically read through that discussion. The impact that brand names actually has. That brand name actually has. So a study by UNICEF has shown that from as young as 2 years of age, then children have the ability to recognize logos. As young as 2 years of age, they can recognize logos. And then by the time they reach 6 or 7, right, they basically are in a position whereby they can ask and demand for the latest trends. Like they don't want that, tacky. They want the other tacky. They want the ordinary, non-brand tacky. They want a particular tacky. Now, what happens is, in terms of our author, he says that that type of fashion, that is the clothing of sinners. That is the clothing of in his language he says debauchers. That's the clothing of the vile people. But in today's time, what happens is, when you have somebody promoting a certain brand, right, then they are looked at as rich, famous, and successful. So when you take a brand or item of clothing and you link it to them, then it's almost as if it's linked to success. But in reality, it's not. Because in reality, these individuals, they are of a very low moral caliber, and value. So that is part of the challenge that we face. So it's important for us to educate our children in this particular manner. And actions speak louder than word. So what do? Just create simplicity. And it doesn't mean that the child is going to grow up very simple, that it's going to be simple all the time. In time and in due time, he will develop an appreciation for other things. But at this particular age, we should engender the ideas of simplicity, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Okay. So I would invite you to read that page on page 47, inshallah, bidnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you can read a bit more about that. Another thing which is mentioned there, sometimes when it comes to clothing, for example, a person feels good. Why? Because he's wearing a new set of clothing. Right? Now what happens is that's fine, but if the happiness or the sadness of a person is tied into whether he's wearing nice clothing or he's wearing other clothing, that becomes problematic. If we live our lives, and some of us do live our lives in that particular manner, that the point is the next upgrade. We're just waiting the whole year through for the next upgrade. The moment we get the upgrade, then we're happier people altogether. Now this becomes very, very problematic when our happiness is tied into this form of consumerism. When this whole idea of like, I will be your friend if you have certain amount of money, if you dress in a certain way, if you wear certain type of clothes, then I'll be your friend. So what is happening? This idea of materialism, the studies actually show that this idea of materialism is enmeshed, in the words that our author used, it is enmeshed in the relationships that people have with one another. So the basis of my relationship with you is because you wear certain type of clothing. My relationship with you is because you have certain type of money. So what advice the author gives, and I think this is very good advice to us from a modern perspective, he says that those type of children who come from a wholesome Islamic home, where they are loved, where time is spent with them, right? These type of children, they have a lesser inclination towards logos, name brands, and fashion and all the things. Why? Because they are fulfilled in a meaningful way, in ways that matter. They don't need to be fulfilled with a logo. They don't need to be filled with a name brand and that type of thing. So what do? We try to create that proper environment at home where our kids are fulfilled as they should be fulfilled. But if we don't give them, that basic qualities of love, respect, kindness, affection, and all of that, then we're going to leave a void. And where are they going to go to fulfill that void? They're going to look for the next car. A nice car is going to fill that void. A nice clothing is going to, the right brands is going to fill that void. They can try and try, but you cannot fill that void. So inshallah, may Allah give us a tawfiq, inshallah, to practice on that particular aspect as regards to clothing. So the author goes on and he says, وَلَا يُنَعَّمُ جِسْمُهُ بِمَلْبَسٍ طُولَ الْمَدَى وَلَا فِرَاشٍ أَمْلَسِ. Yeah, he says that, children, again, the idea of simplicity, they must be made used to and accustomed to simplicity. So he shouldn't be sleeping on an altogether soft bed. He shouldn't be sleeping on an altogether soft bed. And neither should he be given, like bedding in terms of silken bedding and silken blankets and so forth. بَلْ كُلُّ مَا كَانَ بِهِ خَشُونَ فَإِنَّهُ أَخَفُّ لِلْمَؤُونَ. He says, he advises that when we do dress up our children, we should dress them in coarse cloth. So, maybe for us it would be difficult to dress our children in coarse cloth. But the idea is to dress them in simple clothing. And then again he reiterates the point, فَإِنَّهُ أَخَفُّ لِلْمَؤُونَ. Those same 2 points that he mentioned earlier, the advantages of simple clothing. He says it is lighter for the reputation of that child. So lighter in what way? Lighter in a sense that the evil eye is not going to fall upon him, and he's not going to develop this idea of is it ostentation, showing off. He's going to be saved from that. يُصَلِّبُ الْأَعْضَاءَ وَلَا يُبَالِ بِالْمَشْيِ أَوْ بِسَائِرِ الْأَعْمَالِ. And then the children should be trained. Children should be trained, and physical training. And we will see later how an important role the physical training plays in the development of the child. So when we talk about child development, we must keep in mind that Islam doesn't look at things atomistically. Islam looks at things holistically and comprehensively. So we're going to cover all aspects. So when you're looking to develop your child, it's not only in terms of cognitively, the child's intellect must develop, not only that. And at the same time, it's not also that spiritually the child must develop. We're going to look at the cognitive development from an Islamic perspective. We're going to look at the spiritual development. And then also, complementing that, we're going to look at the physical development of the child. So here the author says, يُصَلِّبُ الْأَعْضَاءَ وَلَا يُبَالِ بِالْمَشِي. That you must give him some form of training, physical training, that he gets, used to, and that he basically, hardens up, in terms of his development. وَلَا يُبَالِ بِالْمَشِي أَوْ بِسَائِرِ الْأَعْمَالِ. And a child, he doesn't bother, لَا يُبَالِ, he's not taken aback by what? Bilmashi, by walking. In today's time, we've become so used to driving around that, if we ask our children we're going to walk somewhere, then, it's a problem to walk. How can we walk? So from a young age, the child must be used to doing physical activity. Physical activity. You shouldn't refuse to walk anywhere or to do any form of chores. So you must train the child in that particular manner. What happens with us is that, for example, we eat. So what happens is the mother cooks the food. The mother dishes the food, right? And the mother washes up. Everybody comes, they pull their chair near, they eat and they go away. In terms of my understanding from the Quran, that is incorrect. That's incorrect. And there's another doctor, I forget his name now, and it's a non-Muslim doctor. His theory in terms of raising children, it ties in very well with the Islamic theory. He says you must be firm, but you must be fair. With children, you must be firm, but you must be fair. So in the Quran, and I want you to check this ayah up. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تضار والدة بولدها ولا مولود له بولده. Allah says in the Quran, and the verbatim translation of that verse is that a mother will not be harmed by the child. And neither will the father be harmed by the child. When a child comes into your life, it's not that the child must take over your whole life. There's an imbalance. So while we must give our children their rights, it mustn't be to that degree that, they take over our whole life. أعطِ كل ذي حق حقه. Give every rightful person their right. So by way of example, person is married. The husband fulfills the wife's right, the wife fulfills the husband's right. A baby comes along. So what happens now? The baby takes over everybody's life. The baby sleeps in the bed. The baby's on the mother's arm. So now you're over-fulfilling the right of the child. What about the right of the husband? You with me? What about the right of the mother? So Islam is about the balance. And if you want to create that balance, you must be fair, but you must be firm as well. So back to the example of a child, you must accustom him to walking, and you must accustom him to doing all different forms of work. So what happens? Ideally, if the mother is preparing the food, then the father and the children, they will clean the table, they will do the washing up and everything else. Is that not a fair compromise? For us to work together. And also at the same time, it's not about, even if now and then if the mother wants to do everything, fine, alhamdulillah, Allah reward. But the important thing is that don't do it at the expense of the development of the child. Sometimes it requires a different type of patience when you want to train the children. Look, for you to clean the room is going to take you 15 minutes. But you must train the child, and it might take a half an hour, but you're developing him in the process, or you're developing her in the process. And to develop this type of attitude is very important. And there's so many benefits to it. I remember the week before last, the Prophet ﷺ, he grew up in his uncle's house, right? And for a long time he was with his uncle Abu Talib. For a long time. And his uncle was wealthy, wasn't it? But while the Prophet ﷺ was there, in his uncle's household, and his uncle was taking complete care of him, the Prophet ﷺ still got himself a job as a shepherd, and he would earn some monies. Why did he earn those monies? Because he wanted to contribute to the household. It was very insignificant really, because his uncle Abu Talib was a rich person. So, his contribution was, in monetary terms, insignificant, negligible. But it was the thought that I'm contributing. I'm an active part of the household. Now, I'm not encouraging child labor. Right? What I'm saying is that the children need to be active and they need to be trained. And sometimes very, very simple things that, you and I might have done when we were younger and we didn't think anything about it. But because, we raise our children in a particular way, to walk for our children is something. Nowadays, you can't walk around. If you walk around, myself, my wife, with a pram and our kids, people look at us like something wrong. Because we're so used to everybody's driving. You know what I'm saying? So sometimes, like Moulana Abdul Rahman was explaining last week about the food, sometimes it's not that you don't have the idam, that you don't have the curry. Even when you have the curry, to tell your children, look, you're going to have the bread. There's no, even if there is meat, you're not going to put meat in the food today. To get that training and development. And what does it result in? It definitely results in a degree of appreciation. So these are important lessons which we must try to imbibe, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Right? Wallahu a'lam. Now, there's one thing that comes to my mind now, and maybe we can speak about it. In today's time, subhanAllah, it's very off the topic, but it's something to do with our children. In today's time, sadly, just about, I would say, every child or every second child that you speak to, and something which we must remedy as parents. Whenever a parent speaks to the child speaks back. I find it very disturbing. Whenever a parent speaks to the child's, there's no yes Abi, yes Umi. No Abi, no Umi. So we must try. I put a rule in my house that even if you're right, when Umi talks, you say yes Umi. When Abi talks, you say yes Abi. Wherever I go, sometimes old people with old children, the mother says something to the child still's got something to say back. Always. This is something which we must stop. We must nip it in the bud. It's disrespectful. Even if the child is right. So what happens is, for example, I use myself as an example. I drive, Now, my mother tells me, "Jy ry weer dwars. Why are you driving that way? Take the other way." Now what do? No, Umi, this way is shorter. No. Who say Umi? That way. Okay, Bismillah. That way. What happened? You made your mother's heart happy. She made dua for you in the story. Even if it costs you more petrol. You got to dua for your mother. Every time especially our ummis, every time they say something, but we got the better thing to say. I'm talking about us now, not our children. I'm not talking about the children yet. I'm talking about us now. If an ummi says something, the boys got that. And in most instances, wallahi, it doesn't cost you anything. Fat boys drive. But I almost wanted to go down the main road to see the other shops and stuff. Boys drive, Bismillah. You understand? Don't go there, go there. What is it going to cost you? It costs you nothing. But what do you get? Get the dua of your parents. And the stuff the things happening in our lives is because we don't have the dua of our parents. One day, my brother-in-law from Malaysia, he was raised by his grandmother. So while he was in madrasa, his grandmother passed away. So he went to the teacher, Moulana Abdullah Deula. He went to him and said that my grandmother passed away. So what happens is, normally, if I were to tell you my grandmother passed away, what would you say? You console me. You say, may Allah place sabr in your heart and all of those things. What this ustad said to my brother-in-law, he said, now you must increase in your dua. Why? Because while your grandmother was alive, she was making dua for you. Now that she's passed on, there's a void in the dua. So now you must increase in your dua to make up for that dua which she always used to make for you. So, when we disrespect our parents, we have no value for the dua. When we have no value for the dua, what happens in our lives happens to our lives. And we can see it. Siblings amongst themselves can see. Those who respect their parents, what happens? And now you're surprised now you come at home, and now your wife says to your child something, and then the child backchats. But when your mother spoke to you, then you also backchat. You're wondering, where is this coming from? Coming from you. You understand? So when our mothers and within reasonable bounds, as the Sharia put it, we listen to our parents. Very important. And in doing that, we secure their dua, inshallah, bidhnillah. بل كل ما كان به خشونة فإنه خف للمؤونة يصلب الأعضاء ولا يبالي بالمشي أو بسائر الأعمال. And then the next issue is an issue which relates to sleeping. And there's only basically one line that talks about sleeping and in relation to our children. So the Arabs have a saying, when the children are younger, they are at their most productive. and they're developing and they're growing and they're learning. We should take advantage of these prime years. The Arabs have a saying which reads, Man akthara al-ruqada hurima al-murad. That person who sleeps a lot, then he will be deprived of obtaining his objective. Man akthara al-ruqad, whoever sleeps a lot, hurima al-murad. The objective, he loses it. Because, while you're sleeping, then that benefit that you were supposed to get, it goes by you. Like they say, the early bird catches the worm. So what happens is here, وَيُمْنَعُ النَّوْمَ النَّهَارْ قَطْعًا خَوْفَ الْكَسْلِ أَوْ يَتَّخِذَهُ طَبْعًا. So they say that the child, the advice, and out of as an amana to fulfill in terms of what is written in the kitab, they say that a child shouldn't be allowed to sleep in the course of the day. That's what this says. Now, when you think of that, don't think of that idea. Look at the principle. What is the principle? They say you want to safeguard against two things. The one is laziness. You want to safeguard against laziness. That's the one reason. So, if your pattern is that you allow the child to sleep in the day, but it is for him to be more productive, then no problem. But the idea behind preventing the child from sleeping too much is to prevent laziness from settling in. And number two is that the child takes it as a habit. He must sleep. Otherwise, things won't go right. He must sleep. That's like a habit. So you train the child not to sleep too much. Now, what I would like to add to this particular advice is that, generally our children, we allow them to sleep till very late. But we're supposed to be, from the age of 7, we're supposed to be commanding them of salah. So if you're commanding them for salah, the first salah in terms of the day is the fajr salah. So they must be getting up at that time. And this is very important for the development of our children. If you have children, really try this out. Get them up early. Wake them up for fajr. If fajr is a bit too early, right, in terms of when they make it in the masjid, right, then make sure they make fajr in the waqt. In the waqt. The small children I'm talking about now. And waking up early has tremendous benefits. The Prophet ﷺ has said that the barakah of this ummah has been kept in fi bukuriha, in the early part of the day. There's a person by the name of, I don't know which is the son of the father now, but Stephen Covey. He writes this book, and one of the name of the books is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and Highly Successful People. When he looks at one of the 7 habits is that successful people, they wake up early. The Prophet ﷺ told us 1400 years ago that burika li ummati fi bukuriha, that barakah has been placed in the early hours of the morning for my ummah. When you get up early, how much more productive are you? You go to the masjid, you read your Quran, you do your litany, your wird for the day, then you set up the day. How much more barakah is in your day? Sometimes you look at 10 o'clock, you feel like you've worked the whole day in terms of work that you've done. Right? That's when you wake up early. So now our children must also be trained along those particular lines to wake up early. Because as Muslims, we must be productive. And that is something which we are not. Ourselves, we're not really productive. If we look at ourselves, we're not really productive. And that rigor that we have in life, especially for our religion, that rigor is somewhat lost. We're very, lackadaisical when it comes to our deen. And the same rigor that we maybe had for other things, we don't have for our deen. We must develop that sense of rigor and that sense of productivity. And Allah SWT knows best. Right? Yeah. Now the next particular slide, inshallah, are we good for time? So what time do we finish? I don't want to do like the first week, I think I was a bit too excited or something, and then we went over time, I apologize for that again. So I wouldn't want to take up too much of your time, inshallah, bi'idhnillah. So what time do we start? 12:30. Okay, so just let me know before that time, inshallah. Then we will stop at that time, bi'idhnillah. Now the next issue is a very important issue, which the Musannif rahimahullah addresses now. Now he talks about, the child. In terms of the book that is followed now, what do we speak about? If we go back now, we spoke about sleeping, we spoke about clothing, we spoke about eating before that, and then we spoke about, before that, the first thing was hadana, was in terms of breastfeeding. That's what we spoke about now. So now the child is grown, and now the child reaches the age of 7. Now I know again in the introduction, we spoke about the development of the child. But because they mention it here specifically, I'd just like to run through those timelines again. Our timelines in terms of the development of our children. How do they develop? So now our children has reached the age of 7. What happens now? So the Musannif rahimahullah, he says, وَإِن بَدَتْ أَمَارَةُ التَّمْيِيزِ, when the signs of distinction start showing itself. So the author says now, distinction is what? Distinction. So again, mashallah, this book is really nice, no? And you must read it. Some of the paragraphs you must read it again and again. Okay, that's for me. I'm not so sharp, but many of the paragraphs, when I read it once, twice, thrice, the third time I read it, I get a good appreciation of it. There's really some really nice facts in this particular kitab. So when he talks about distinction. So you say the child reaches the age of 7, that's the age of distinction. Distinction of what? So he talks about distinction. One definition is distinction between good and bad. Good and bad. Or beneficial and harmful. That's generally the age of 7. And then he gives another definition, which is a nice definition also. He says now the child reaches an age of distinction. What is meant? Conceptualization. Before, the child can't conceive something. But now at the age of 7, when you explain a particular phenomenon to the child, what happens? The child can now conceive of it. Even though he might not see it in front of him, the child can now conceive of it. So that particular idea of tamheez, what does the scholar refer to it as? He says, وَكُلُّ فَهْمٍ فَاضِلٍ عَزِيزٍ. And now what does he develop? He develops a sense of understanding. وَصَارَ يَسْتَحِي مِنَ الْأُمُورِ. Now this is a point which I came to learn now. So the child becomes 7 years of age. So what happens now? He's able to distinguish. But at that age also what happens? He develops the sense of modesty. Sense of modesty. For example, if you maybe use yourself as a major premise and look at your own set of circumstance. If you have a 2-year-old child and the husband kisses the wife, right? How does it affect the 2-year-old child? But the 7-year-old, if the husband hugs the wife, and then what does the 7-year-old do? He hides his face, or they react differently, right? If I were to hug my wife, what my son does is he runs and hugs me. I don't know what type of reaction is that. But I think maybe he also feels that he needs to be loved, so he also wants to be part. So a 2 hug becomes a group hug, and whatever the case may be, right? But the important point is, when they become of age, 7 years of age, what happens? It's almost as if at the time that Allah places the intellect within them, Allah places the sense of modesty within them as well. And that must be nurtured now. Okay? So what happens is, there are 2 types of modesty our scholars explain. And before I read it here, our scholars always used to explain this to us. And I was heartened, to actually read it in this book as well. There are 2 types of modesty. The one modesty is that natural modesty which Allah places within you. That's one way of modesty, natural modesty. Then through the Sharia, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Sharia sets certain parameters. And that parameters maintains modesty as well. For example, like no free, unchecked, unfettered intermingling between the sexes. So that's the parameter. Why does the Sharia place that parameter? To maintain modesty, to maintain bashfulness. So we should look after both, that natural modesty which Allah has placed within us, and also those parameters which Allah SWT has placed in terms of law. Right? We have been created, men and female, and there will be occasions when we do mix marketplaces, etc., etc., etc. But unchecked, unfettered, unrestricted intermingling, that is something which the Sharia does not condone. Again, to maintain our modesty. Right? And Allah SWT knows best. So, فَذَاكَ أَوَّلُ بُدُوِّ النُّورِ. And now what happens is, the author he makes a very nice point there. He says, this is the beginning of light. These 2 things, so the child is like a twin light now. His intellect and his sense of modesty. These twin lights. So this is now, why is it called a light? So the author has different interpretations for that. So he says the reason why it's called a light, your intellect is called a light. Why? Because it is that light that is going to take you away from darkness towards light. In other words, from this world which is symbolic of darkness, is going to take you to the afterlife, and that is symbolized by light. And the other one is that the other reason why this intellect is referred to as light. There's a narration that reads as follows, that it says that this world is the home for the person who does not have a home. Worldly possession is the possession of a person who does not have any other possession. And then the last part, it eludes me now, but if you give me a second, inshallah, I'll just check it up very quickly. The last part reads as follows. It says that the one who gathers this world is a person who has no intellect. Now, we need to understand that, that is like very easy to, okay, person doesn't have an intellect. But I think that type of statement needs to be justified. A person who amasses worldly wealth has no intellect. That's a heavy statement. So let's look at other narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. It says, Al-Kayyisu man dana nafsahu wa amina lima ba'd al-maut. That a clever person is that person who keeps track of himself and does action for the year after. That's a clever person. So when we look at it, just look at it in investment terms. A clever person is, in investment terms, a person who makes a short-term sacrifice for a long-term goal. You put a few hundred rands away today, and then, in terms of investment, it comes back to you in bigger ways. Now, the best investment you can make is to sacrifice the short life for everlasting bliss and success. So, the silly person really, the person without the intellect, is that person who he is not prepared to sacrifice short-term for long-term benefit. So, according to all of us, we'd say that's a silly person. So, along those lines, the Prophet ﷺ says that the person who only works for this world has no intellect. Why? Because anybody with the intellect will be prepared to make a short-term sacrifice for a long-term goal. And that is the context in which we need to understand these particular narrations. فَذَاكَ أَوَّلُ وَقْتٍ فَهْمُ الطِّفْلِ أَشْرَكَ بِهَا عَلَيْهِ نُورُ الْأَقْلِ. So, this really is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which He gives to the child, to the person. And by means of it, he can now distinguish between things, this intellect, this light which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him. So what I want to do is, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to quickly again run through the timeline, and I want to point out to you the timeline, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe at a later stage, when we are like sort of, up and running, then we can also, I can show it to you more graphically. I'd like to show it to you graphically, but for now, inshallah, if you can just follow me in terms of the timeline. So we said that before the age of 7, we have a non-discerning minor. This is really a child. So this child is in the garden of bliss and you keep him there. We spoke the week before last about, these early learning programs is something that we really need to check. From our perspective, from an Islamic perspective, that 0 to 7, you don't teach a child formally. Informally, if you put him into a program, no problem. In other words, don't take the child out to the garden of bliss before the time. Allow him to revel in the garden of bliss for as long as the Sharia allows him to. And that's up until the age of 7. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, he says that, if a child before 7, the child before 7 has no conceptualization of bad. So if a child does something wrong, there's no malice or that he intended bad by it. The child is just pure and innocent. And we must facilitate, that pureness and innocence for as long as the child is a child as well. Then after that, the child develops from 7 to 14. The child now becomes a discerning minor. That's now when you start the formal instruction of the child. And next week, inshallah, when Moulana Abdul Rahman comes, we're going to come to that point. He's now 7. So now he's reached that age of distinction. And we know what distinction is. Allah places the intellect, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses him with this sense of modesty. But now you must start formally teaching the child. So what do you start with? So Moulana Abdul Rahman will start with that next week, inshallah. And then from 14 onwards, how do you treat the child? And then thereafter, so when it comes to a discerning minor, there's a few things which I think which needs to be ironed out in terms of the capacity that this child has. So the other day I went to my friend's house. So what happened was, when I came to the door, so his child opened up the door, right, and said to me that my father said you can come in and you can have a seat. He's coming now. So when the father came, I said, when your son came to the door, it reminded me of a a fiqh mas'ala. And the fiqh mas'ala is, what is the capacity of a child? What is the capacity of a child? So can a child buy and sell? For example, you buy your child a Lego set. So the child goes to school. It's a toy day. So he goes to school and takes the Lego set. And his best friend says to him, look, I'll give you 3 lollies for your Lego set. And the child wholeheartedly agrees. What are you going to do? I think it depends whose child is yours, not the one with the lollipops or the one with the Legos. No matter, right? From an Islamic perspective, we're going to say that this child has no contractual capacity. Cannot buy, cannot sell. So therefore, that sale from the outset is null and void. Whether you say, I buy and I sell and you agreed upon the price, the sale is null and void. Right? But so our scholars say that he doesn't have any contractual capacity. But does he have a capacity? So they say, our Shafi ulama make 2 exceptions. The one exception is when the child receives a gift. The child doesn't have contractual capacity. But we make an exception and we say the child has the capacity to receive a gift. So when you go around in Ramadan and you take cookies, we send all our young children. Do they have the capacity to actually exchange gifts? Yes, they have, but that's the exception to the rule. And the other exception is that when somebody comes to the house, and the child serves as a messenger, the child has the capacity to do that. But other than that, in a contractual way, the child doesn't have a capacity. So these are important things to understand. For example, if it's an important message, so can the child act as a wakil? So if the child doesn't have contractual capacity, strictly speaking, can the child go to the shop and buy a bread? But you send the child to buy the bread, don't you? Right? But does the child have the capacity to independently buy the bread? No. So if the child doesn't have the capacity to independently buy the bread, then you cannot appoint the child as a proxy to do the same. So capacity is important for us to understand the capacity of the child. Right? Even if you go according to the Hanafi ulama say that if a child enters into a sale agreement, like he goes and he buys the bread, they say that sale is valid, but pending on what? Pending on the permission of the parent. Right? So what happens is, it's not that your child can't buy anything. It is that this must be used as a training ground. So you train the child. You take this amount of money and then you buy that. So you train the child. That's fine. But the child doesn't have a contractual capacity as such. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best. The ulama differ, but I just thought we'd highlight that particular point in this particular regard. Okay. But when it comes to acts of worship now, so we saw contractually, let's say, and this is not found in our communities. Okay, but let's get into, we have 3 minutes left, inshallah. So we'll just quickly go to the ritual acts of worship. So in terms of the ritual acts of worship, when a child is 7 years of age and older, we discussed this also, the child's ibadat, when the child, what does the child do? Make salah. The child fasts. Right? The child may even perform umrah or hajj. Are those accepted? So according to our ulama, we say that the child does have the capacity. So therefore you have a non-baligh child sometimes leading us in tarawih. So he might not have the contractual capacity, but he has the capacity to perform ibadat, right? And so forth, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Khair, inshallah. The last point that we made in the last time round was very important to highlight the different stages of development in an Islamic paradigm and in a non-Islamic paradigm, right? And I think we should, in our own way, treat our children differently. Along the Islamic line, a child is a non-discerning minor, a discerning minor, and then at the age of 14, the child becomes an adult. And though we might not treat the child as an adult in a worldly way, but in as far as the law of Allah is concerned, we should be treating the child as an adult because he is an adult by Allah. But now in the Western paradigm, what happens is the child becomes a minor, non-discerning, discerning minor. Then instead of becoming an adult, there's not that transition to adulthood immediately. That child now becomes an adolescent. So what is adolescence? We are very indulgent when it comes to adolescence. That period from the 14 to 21 or 15 to 21. And all our problems really comes in that particular period. Why? Because in the Western paradigm, right, and I've read certain articles that say the reason why the West introduced that adolescent period is for monetary gain. There's clear monetary gain in that particular. The reason why we have school extended over this amount of time, I feel it's children spend too much time at school. What they learn over that 12 years, they could very well learn much shorter. In terms of our learning period is, the child, you start teaching from 7 till what age? Till 14, 7 years you have enough to teach him. And thereafter he becomes an adult. Right? So the point is that some argue, right? And I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but some argue that, you know, the extended formal teaching years, it is for monetary gain, wallahu alam. But what we can acknowledge is that that period from 14, that adolescence, right, is, how do we define that period? We define that period where adults are allowed to behave as children for longer than they're supposed to be children, right? So it's something for us to keep in mind. And we should, I think, treat our children very differently when they reach the age of puberty. We should impress upon them, even maybe if you don't give him the car keys to drive around, he doesn't have his own bank account, he doesn't stay on his own. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that from the Sharia perspective, he must be treated as an adult. Because he is an adult. And now if you're going to treat him like a child, it's basically allowing a child to be a child longer than what he is, and that creates problems. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. أقول قولي, it's exactly half past. وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولوالدي ولوالديكم ولسائر المسلمين كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.